A brief intro. There are people here who are meeting me for the first time, so I thought I'll just spend a minute on that. So I'm Prabha Srinivasan. I'm a founder, CEO of Ventura Pranas. It is a cross-border advisory and compliance firm specializing in US and India tax and compliance and advisory. And we are a 100-member team, and we're located between Chennai, Los Angeles, Trichy, and Bangalore. I'm dual certified, and that was the genesis of the firm, and we've grown since our formation in 2011. I'm going to switch to our tax planning strategies. So we already discussed how an Indian resident is subject to lower TDS, right? That 1% is a big deal. It's still a pain, but it's so much smaller than 23.92%. And then we also talked a little bit about all these code sections that give you so much relief on the capital gains side. So I tell my US sellers who are not looking at huge deals, smaller size deals, to possibly look at gifting these assets to Indian resident close family members that meet the specs of qualified relatives in India. I've mentioned the code section, please look it up. But what this allows you to do is it actually moves the asset into the hands of an Indian resident, and then suddenly anything US is no longer a problem for you to deal with, right? That person only has to deal with Indian taxation. He does not have to worry about California, federal, none of that. He can sell the asset, and then the capital gains that gets generated, he deals with Indian taxes. He can do any planning you want him to do. Let's say you want to get another replacement property. Perhaps he can even do that for you and then gift you the asset later. But it allows you some flexibility to get away from the US taxation. It does have its downside, and you'll see it when we get to the FEMA rules, in that you're giving it to a FEMA resident, which means your ability to tap into that liquidity is going to get stifled, because an Indian resident can only send out $250,000 per year abroad or to a non-resident Indian to their NRO account in India. And if you're looking at millions of dollars that are due to you, you could be looking at decades to get your money back. So, it's like it's a delicate balance. So I'm going to talk about some other considerations. If you're looking at a huge, more and more I'm hearing so many more of my clients are more asset rich in India than they were in the US, because they've got a huge inheritance. The lands that their parents bought at a pittance are now worth millions. And they're sitting in California. And I always tell them, well, if there is a means for you to break that residency, why don't you start it? California is a very smart state, by the way. They're not going to let you just leave, pack up your bags. They want various factors to be considered, but some states are more forgiving than others. So if you're in a high tax state like New York City, California, you may want to consider trying to break that residency and start working ahead of time, because it's a facts and circumstances driven challenge. The second is agricultural land. As you know, agri land, you could have inherited it as an NRI, but if you had just had a resident Indian who owned agri land, that agri land on sale would have accrued no taxes in India, and then suddenly you're looking at a federal bill and a California bill that is just outlandish. Again, I say that maybe you should look at taxing it in a resident's hands. If you've got parents who are still alive, keep it in their names. Try and get it after. You'll get the benefit of the step up in basis, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then, it's unfortunate, but it is the fact of the day that when you sell property, there is a cash component, and it is not easy for our US citizens to tap into it. I get these questions all the time. We don't deal with that at all. My only answer to you is, if you're in a deal where you've got resident Indian relatives and yourself a non-resident, tweak that ratio in such a way that you get more of it in banking through banking channels, and you're kind of passing that burden to someone else. And then the gift tax life exemption. It's easy for me to say gift, but I want you to keep that gift limits in the US in mind. There is a 12.92 million threshold, right? Everybody has during their lifetime. It's going to go down effective Jan 1st, 2026. Thanks to the Republicans, we've got a huge estate exemption between a married filing joint couple. That's $26 million of an estate that you can have and not be exposed to estate taxes. Keep in mind that if you make these gifts, you're whittling down that life exemption. So you'll have that much less when you expire. So that is one. And then I've also put in another example there, which is, I get this a lot, clients who have received inheritances and say, I never wanted it. It was really intended for my resident sibling who's in India, and I want them to have it. My answer to you is, if that is clear from the get-go, you've got 9.5 months from the time you get, wind of it, or from the date of death, actually, of the decedent, to say that you don't need it anymore, and you don't have to use your lifetime exemption. Okay, so if you know you're not going to keep it, then you're better off relinquishing it as quickly as possible before the 9.5 limit comes upon you, so that you don't have to use up any part of your lifetime exemption. But a lot of people come to me and say, well, what if I just threw all my Indian assets? I've got my green card, my application is in process, I've not gotten the approval yet, but I've got a ton of assets in India and I want to just put it into a trust. And can it keep the income outside the US taxes? And the answer is no. US says you should have 5 clear years before you establish intent to create residency in the US. And intent means putting in an application for a green card. So if you know that's possible, your kids are going to be on you and say, you got to move, mom and dad, you're too old for us to look after in India, you've got to come over to the US. My answer is, if you want to consider a trust structure for your assets, it has to be done. You have to have 5 clear years before you actually make an application for your green card. The second comment I want to make is, a lot of people get their green card approval, but that doesn't take effect until they set foot into the United States at a port of entry. And so you can actually time that, and it doesn't become effective until you get it. So my advice to clients is that if you know you're going to liquidate assets in India, do it early in the year, and then go towards the end of a financial, of a calendar year in the US, because calendar year is Jan through December for tax purposes in the US. And let's say you sell all your assets Jan to July, you move towards October, November, December in the US. You are a non-resident for the early part of the year. None of those gains have to be offered to tax in the US. And so you've engineered it well. Even for California purposes, this is going to help. You're not going to attract taxes on these sales. So my point is, try and plan your large capital gains events around these decisions. I think it's going to help you in the long run. And I think those were the 3 major points that I thought of for the people who are applying for green card. Transfer of real estate, I keep getting these questions. I even had 2 people ask me this today, is, what do I do with assets? I've got a range of assets. So obviously there are 2 options that lie in your hands. Do I give it now, or do I give it upon my death, right? And so for the assets that are best transferred during your lifetime are assets that have a low cost today, haven't really experienced huge appreciation, but have a future potential appreciation possibility. Those are great to transfer over, to others or to a trust, because the stamp duty is a consideration. When you create a trust for the benefit of others, you have to keep that in mind. Quote unquote, please look for FEMA guidance. If you've got non-resident beneficiaries to a trust, it could be a non-starter, or you'll have to tiptoe around the rules. You might have to create a revocable trust in India where you've got Indians in the mix, and and then it transfers over. But my point to you is, those are good assets. Why? Because when you make these gifts, you don't have to use much of your lifetime exemption if you're a US person, and all future growth has already skipped a generation, which makes it so much easier for estate duties in the US. After death bequests, I usually tell people, if you know you're not going to sell an asset, it's going to stay in the family for generations, just do it through a will. Why is this? I already showed you the power of the fair market value and the date of death, and how it saves you a tremendous amount of taxes. That's a huge benefit. And so all those cap gains, right, that was from the time that person, the decedent, enjoyed during his lifetime, is suddenly all tax-free to the inheritor. And then finally, I ask you to consider testamentary trust options. These are trusts that are created upon the death of a person through a will. So it allows for seamless transitions. It solves for FEMA. You can have non-resident individuals, beneficiaries to a testamentary trust, and the stamp duty considerations become considerably more palatable. Okay, so it makes it a much easier and more sensible way to transfer assets to the next gen.